Okay, so I'm James Rabeau from the Sydney Nano Institute. I'm the Deputy Director for Industry, Innovation and Commercialization. And I'd like to thank you all for joining the session today. Before beginning, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we all are and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dig Howitt, the CEO of Cochlear, who is here to talk to us in an informal conversation style about the company Cochlear, about innovation, about research and manufacturing in Australia, and I imagine many other aspects of a big tech company headquartered here in Australia. Just for people on the call, please keep your mics on mute, obviously. We're going to have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to ask some questions that I've jotted down ahead of time. If you have questions along the way, put them into the chat box. I've got people helping to spot those. And if there's an opportunity, I'll grab them and read them out to Dig. And then time permitting towards the end, we can have some general Q&A as well. Again, just where I'm sort of facilitating that, just to make it easy technologically. The last housekeeping piece is that we are recording this, although, yeah, I'm assuming we're recording this, but I don't see the record function on, but we are going to be recording the session. So just keep that in mind. Okay, I've already said that we have Dig Howitt with us today. Dig is the CEO of Cochlear. He's been the CEO since 2018, and I was actually amazed to see that he's been with the company since 2000, which seems like a heck of a long time, but it's 20 years and CEO. He is also a University of Sydney alumnus from the School of Faculty of Engineering, Electrical Engineering to be precise. And Dig, just for your benefit, the audience today are affiliated with the Sydney Nano Institute, and the Sydney Nano Institute is what we call here a multidisciplinary institute. And we will have people from engineering, science, medicine, business, arts, the whole spread across the university, which is fantastic. And so there's many things that are going to be grabbed up by people who are listening today. So thanks very much for joining us again. We really appreciate your time. And let me just start off. So I've already said that you're the CEO. Can you just tell us a bit about Cochlear in general as a business, and then maybe a bit about what it's like running one of the biggest hardware technology companies in Australia?
James, look, thank you, and thanks everyone for joining, and good to have the opportunity to share just a little bit about Cochlear through this afternoon. Just let me start with, I remember my time at the University of Sydney very fondly, which most was spent in the engineering school, but I did certainly the engineering course then, perhaps the same now, is that the first 2 years were heavily science-based, and certainly a lot of physics in the first 2 years of my degree. And I make the point to people that that's probably the most valuable learning I had was the physics, that it is absolutely still relevant today in understanding the issues and some of the problems we face, certainly from a technology perspective. But, having a grounding in physics is, even if it's only 2 years, not a full degree, certainly very valuable in trying to understand some of the technology challenges that we face. But let's come to Cochlear. Cochlear is a terrific company, which as a company, we turn 40 next year. But the story of Cochlear is longer than that. It goes back to 1967 when Professor Graham Clark, who was a surgeon, medical doctor and surgeon, set out to restore hearing, and with the goal of restoring sense, inspired in part by his father, who had a disabling hearing loss. He did this at the University of Melbourne, and over 11 years through to 1978, developed genuinely significant understanding of how hearing works, and in that time developed a prototype implant, which was implanted in 1978. It was successful. And at the time around the world, there were actually a number of different groups and universities around the world working on trying to develop a cochlear implant, try to restore hearing using electrical signals. And Graham Clark and his team at the University of Melbourne were the first. And that then led, and I won't go into this now, but I'm happy to the commercialisation of the cochlear implant in 1982 by the Nucleus Group, which was owned by Paul Traynor, an Australian-based global medical device company. And so next year 1981, so next year Cochlear turns 40. So over that 40 years, we've developed from a startup with originally 4 employees to now having over 4,000 people around the world, from having 4 prototype implants done by Graham Clark to then developing a commercial one, just implanted in 1982. We've now got over 600,000 people around the world who have one or two of our implants and depend on those implants for hearing. Those people are spread across 180 countries around the world. Cochlear employees are based in now 40 countries around the world. We obviously are, as James said, a hardware company. Increasingly, as with all hardware companies, there's an increasing level of software and firmware and digital connectivity that all goes, but it all sits around the hardware. We do 90% of our global manufacturing in Australia. It's at our headquarters at Macquarie University, and a factory in Lane Cove, and another factory up in Brisbane. So somewhat unique for an Australian company too, on that respect, that the vast majority of our manufacturing still is in Australia, and we have an intention to keep significant manufacturing in Australia. And we do about 2/3 of our global R&D in Australia. Now, we do have, as you'd expect, a global R&D network. Doesn't make sense to do it all in one country, but about 2/3 is done in Australia. And we have about 100, at any time, about 100 university research partnerships in various forms, from very small to quite significant, with a whole range of topics, from incremental innovations through to some breakthrough. Hopefully, what we hope will be some breakthrough innovation. So, very diverse company. Our sales last year, measure of revenue, 1.4 billion Australian dollars. So the company's listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, and there we are valued at around about 14 billion Australian dollars, which puts us about the 30th biggest company on the ASX. So getting to be more and more significant. I think we've been a small company going to a bigger company. I think we're definitely still a small big company, but enormous opportunity to grow, just because there are so many people suffering from hearing loss, for which at the moment cochlear implants, for acoustic implants, it's another branch. Products we've got are the best available solution. Not widely taken up, and I can get into that, but certainly the best available for people past a certain threshold of hearing loss. So perhaps, James, I'll stop there. I can go lots of different ways from there, but I'll let you sort of guide with questions.
Yeah, well, it's great, and it's a brilliant introduction. One of the things that we're interested in, and we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, is obviously we're a university. We have many researchers doing research. Cochlear is held up as a great success story, but there aren't many of those, even globally. I mean, to have something that you can trace back to the way this does with Graham Clark at the University of Melbourne. Now, you've only been there for 20 years, not 40 years, but what do you know anecdotally? Is there anything else that you can shed light on about those early stages? What was the magic? What happened that made this work?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I understand it completely. And I've talked to people who were there, notably Jim Patrick is one, and Jim worked with Graham Clark and then was the first Cochlear employee, and still he's semi-retired but still working part-time with us. And I think there's a few things. First of all, is that the cochlear implant is a complicated system, and one of the things Graham Clark did incredibly well was build a multidisciplinary team that actually genuinely worked together to solve this problem. So this is definitely part of medical problem. There are issues of audiology, material science. What sort of materials can you actually put in the body that will last? Clearly, there are significant mechanical and electrical engineering issues in terms of the development of an implant, and even back then, pretty significant software load as well. So actually, in terms of developing the implant, absolutely a multidisciplinary engagement. And Graham did a terrific job of getting a multidisciplinary team together. I think the other very important ingredient, and one of the reasons why Cochlear was the first company to commercialise, was the Nucleus Group. And so the Nucleus Group was run by Paul Traynor. Paul Traynor was an entrepreneur who started a number of medical and medical device-based companies in Australia in the 70s and into the 80s. And at the time, he had sort of the world-leading pacemaker company, Telectronics. So developed and manufactured in Australia pacemakers for the world. You don't sort of think about Australia in the 1970s as being world-leading in medical device, but we were. And the technology that he had, or that was in the Nucleus Group, with the pacemakers, was very relevant to cochlear implants. So it sort of gave a head start in the commercialisation. So having relevant, so you had a driven academic researcher, you had an entrepreneur with relevant capabilities, and there was some government funding that went in there as well. And I think Paul Traynor was actually pretty good at leveraging government funding, but there was a couple of direct grants from the Fraser government that helped specifically supporting the commercialisation of the cochlear implant. The first one was the initial stage of commercialisation, sharing the risk on trying to develop a commercial implant. And then there was also a grant to help with US market entry. Again, which is that's difficult for an Australian company to do. So I do think you need a driven researcher who understands the whole solution, not just the bit that they're the discipline expert, an entrepreneur who or a business that has relevant capabilities in the drive, and that absolutely there is a role for government in supporting the process of commercialisation.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, in terms of the government funding, I think we'll always, regardless of what level of funding and support we get from the government, we'll always say we need more. And I think, yeah, those three aspects are, it's just good to tease that out from this Cochlear story. One thing though I picked up on is a fourth item I think that is crucial to the formula, and that is that Graham Clark, I didn't realize this, I think he said his father suffered from hearing loss and issues. So he was very much front of mind about the problem, and he probably saw this thing every day. And that's something that we're trying to do a little bit differently in general university, and that is not make assumptions. Yeah, we have lots of driven teams, and we can develop entrepreneurial skills and find funding, but it's about finding the problem to solve. So in fact, that's possibly the most crucial starting point. I guess maybe I might just go into sort of taking that from where it was 40 years ago to today. You're located at the University of Macquarie Uni campus, and you mentioned that you have around 100 different partnerships. What does the interaction with researchers look like for you, for Cochlear today, and what is working well? Yeah,
it's a good question, and again, I'm doing some work with the government now on the commercialisation of university research and how can we be better at it. So it's something I'm trying to get my head around. I am by no means an expert, but have some insight. And I think across those partnerships that we have around the world, the results and outcomes do vary. I do think that the point you made, James, about Graham Clark had a real understanding and a real passion for what he was trying to do from personal experience. And I'd certainly say some of our most successful university partnerships are driven by someone with passion. So, and whether it's from direct personal experience or just a strong belief in or desire to change the world or to change an aspect of the world, I do think that real sort of drive and initiative is important. I think that relates to being clear about in these partnerships who brings what to them. And so, one of the things I think you can't force fit a partnership on research. I think there's got to be a genuine need or desire on our part of the company to say, what is it that we're looking for? What area are we interested in exploring, and why is that relevant to our mission of helping people hear? And from the research side, what's the who is it that's really engaged in trying to solve this problem or something very close to this problem? So it actually becomes core to both of our work, rather than if you get a force fit, you get a sort of a high risk of a mismatch, or a lack of commitment or lack of alignment. And I think that's perhaps one of there's lots of reasons we've got 100 partnerships, but that's perhaps one of them, is we just finding that perfect fit isn't going to happen every time, and you can't. Sometimes you don't know till you're in there too, so you can't exclusively look for that, because I think you could look forever and find very few, and you probably miss some good ones as well.
Yeah, I think that's evident in the effective partnerships that I've seen or been a part of. They organically grow over a period of time, and it's a lot about trust and building the relationship. I want to just ask a few things on sort of following on from that, is the R&D program. And again, I'm just sort of picking up things that you mentioned earlier on, that some of it is here and some of it is global. It doesn't make sense to do everything in Australia. How easy is it? How good is it here in Australia to do R&D? And what are the drivers for doing some offshore and some onshore?
Yeah, good question. Because R&D is obviously critically important for us. We spent 180 million Australian dollars last year on R&D. We're aiming to spend about 12% of our annual sales in R&D, which for a hardware company is high. And we do, and in that we have a whole portfolio, from incremental improvements to our existing product range to 10 and 15-year projects, which are based on good logic and good science, but you sort of don't know till you get there if they're actually going to work. And so certainly a spectrum in that portfolio. And I think one of the things Cochlear's done terrifically well over time is actually think very long term about our technology and about what the technology can do, and not just focus on what's the immediate issues. In terms of Australia, I actually think it's a great place to do a lot of our R&D, and particularly a lot of our R&D around the product. I think for a couple of reasons. We do, we get from universities outstanding graduates, very smart. I think they're well equipped, and well equipped in and certainly our thinking and my thinking is actually really strong in the basics. So, there's always talk about should universities be graduating people who are job ready? I think yes, but not if making people job ready comes at the expense of making sure there is a core understanding of the basic science and basic engineering. We can teach job readiness, we can't teach basic physics. But we do get really, really good graduates. I think the other thing, and it's one of the advantages of being a little bit unique in Australia is less competition for graduates. So certainly different to being in Silicon Valley, for example, where people will move very quickly between jobs, and there's value in that, but from a company perspective, that is harder. Look, I think the area where we are finding it more difficult in Australia for an R&D is on the software side, and that's in part because software is part location agnostic. You can do it anywhere, so people in Australia can work for a whole range of different high-tech software companies. And it also, it permeates the business. We compete with banks for good software engineers, for example. that's certainly an area we struggle at is software engineering, but for sort of engineers, materials scientists, for example, we do incredibly well in Australia. And I think people work together well. We're pretty creative. I mean, if you look at the research output across Australian universities, it's I think ranked up in the top 10 in the world on some of the measures I've looked at. And we're pretty good at being creative and doing research. So I think it's a good place. In terms of what do we put where, we tend to in Australia, where most of our manufacturing is, we do most of our product development that is related to the manufacturing, because that is important. But otherwise, we do look around the world and say, where are skills differently? So we're actually now doing more, increasing the amount of our software in Europe. For example, we've got a number of research collaborations in Europe on, I think I'd call them sort of tangentially related topics. There seems to be some pretty good funding, some good ideas and some pretty good funding in Europe to support some of the funds we put in. But we don't have I think we're moderately systematic, I'd say, about where do we do it, rather than purely intensely systematic about how we think about what we do where.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one of the challenges. You mentioned Silicon Valley and Europe. Whilst on your side, it's competition for talent, for instance. On the university researcher side, there aren't a lot of take hardware companies, engineering related. There aren't a huge number to pick and choose from and set up these partnerships. So that's just a comment. I want to ask one more thing about the research and industry kind of connection, and or one more thing right now, and that is what about so you've mentioned that it's that the people that you get here in Australia are skilled at what you need. Maybe there's a bit of a gap in terms of software. What about how you work with how universities work with you, and what blockages there are? What could maybe a way to put it is, what could we do better?
Yeah, good. It's a good question, James, and a tricky one too. I think there's or not always, often issues around intellectual property, and I think mostly they get solved reasonably well, but there's still times when we get hung up on that, and I think sometimes and it's not surprising, because we get passionate people involved and you think there's something terrifically valuable here. But I do think there are cases when we spend more time thinking about what this could be worth, rather than how do we actually do it. And getting it's important, but getting that balance right is important. I think it's it actually is hard work to get alignment, and it takes time. And I'll use our presence on Macquarie University campus as an example. So we moved in 10 years ago, 10 years and a month ago, to Macquarie University, with a goal of really trying to collaborate closely. The Macquarie University has quite some focus on hearing loss. It has the Australian Hearing Hub there. We said, how do we work together sort of across the university, rather than just a specific project here and there? And I think it took us 5 or 6 years to actually work that out. And it was really only when we started to say, actually, we need to have genuine alignment at the top of both organisations. We're really going to collaborate sort of across university. You can't just hope. You've got to have genuine alignment at very senior level. So now we have a sort of a bi-monthly steering committee of some of our executives, some of the deputy vice chancellors at Macquarie, meeting and talking about what is it that we can do together, where is the opportunity. We have a joint pool of money that we then jointly fund some programs. So that's the way we found to do it at a sort of at a very high programmatic level across university. But it took a lot of work to get that alignment, and you're not going to be not seen as just a pool of money. I think when we first turned up, it was sort of fantastic. Here's this company with a whole lot of money. They'll fund anything we ask them to, and there was a lot of filtering of, no, we're only going to fund things that are commercially relevant to us, and we're absolutely looking for many things to defray the risk by having some joint funding, whether that's from the university or from grants or whatever. So it's a hard one, but I do think back to that common core understanding of what are we trying to do and a real passion to do it.
Well, I think you're being generous because there are a lot of issues that we hear, and we could probably have an entire call on that. I'm getting a couple of questions from people in the audience. So let me ask. This kind of builds on what you've just been speaking about. Professor Zdenka Kuncic from the School of Physics is asking, from your perspective, where do you see strategic opportunities for industry, university, R&D collaboration more generally?
Oh, good question. And I think it's absolutely a very topical question. So I'm doing some work with the government on university research commercialisation, and we only just started, but I know this issue is going to come up. And I think it's a tricky one. So I think if we want to take that research and actually deliver value for, I think, the country out of it, perhaps you could argue value for society more broadly, then it does need to be translated or commercialised. And so I think then to do that, it needs to be, that research really needs to be in an area where we are strong on the research front, but also we are strong on the industrial side. Because I think if you don't have those ingredients, it's going to be hard to realise the potential of that research. So then you get to, well, industries that Australia has some strength in. So mining, and I do, what I understand from talking to mining companies, and I don't do that a lot, but when I do, they understand they work pretty well with a number of universities. I think food, a strong agricultural base, and I think sort of food and agriculture is an area. Medical devices we actually are good at. Between Cochlear and ResMed, there's a whole range of smaller companies at various stages of development, many of them with employees that have come from ResMed or Cochlear over time. So I think, in CSL there on the sort of biological side too, I think is a strength. But I do think, so I think it's in those areas, and I think we just got to be careful not, this goes both ways, of pushing too far beyond what we already know. And there was, Australian Financial Review had its innovation summit this week, and this debate came up that said, should we be trying to pick winners as a country or not? There's this argument for, and I'm actually in the camp of for, but there was another camp that says, no, just get the basics right, and the winners will emerge. So I'm certainly more on the world is a very competitive place. We have a number of countries that come to Cochlear and say, can you come and set up in our country, research with our universities, do manufacturing, do research, whatever it is, because we can see the value you bring, and here's what we'll do for you in terms of subsidies and tax rates and so on. So it is intensely competitive on an international scale.
Well, let me jump in, because a question has come in, and just by the way, I apologize for any questions that I don't get to. I'm trying to manage a bunch of topics, but it is competitive globally, and in particular, well, your sector and what you're doing is highly competitive. What strategic advantages, if any, comparative advantages are there that endure here in Australia that keep Cochlear here? Why not go over to? I mean, okay, I realize there's going to be some philosophical argument that I believe, but anyway, what are your thoughts?
Excuse the doorbell at home today. A few things. The first of those is that this is a good, we do have highly educated, highly skilled people in Australia. So it is a good place to have a knowledge business. Our healthcare system is pretty good. One of the reasons Cochlear has been successful is Australia was and still is the best place in the world to have a child with hearing loss, bar none. terms of the path for care. And so us being able to integrate sort of end to end from the research through manufacturing through to the clinical outcomes and have the best clinical outcomes in the world helps us build our knowledge and take that overseas. So I think that whole ecosystem, if I can use that word, is important. And look, and I think broadly, Australians can be pretty creative, and actually, and it's tough to generalise across a whole nationality. But I do think that we are and have shown strong capability and creativity and the ability to get things done. And the other bit I'd come back to, look, industries where we have a natural strength is an important area to help us focus too.
I'm following this as it kind of comes up, but on a similar token, I find it a little bit surprising that you have manufacturing in Australia. I have a naive perspective of it. What is it that keeps manufacturing here? And
look, a couple of things. So one is, look, our product is high value, low volume, so that you don't have there's no freight. No concern about how much it costs to transport around the world. Secondly, it is high quality. One of the I think actually one of the core reasons that Cochlear is the leader, global leader, is we've had outstanding product quality from day one, and that product quality comes from design, but it's integrally linked to manufacturing and the manufacturing processes, and particularly for a cochlear implant, when you're doing the design, you also develop the manufacturing processes in parallel or at the same time, because there's not off-the-shelf processes that you just sort of sketch your design out and then buy various bits of equipment, and those bits of equipment do all the things you need. Our manufacturing, a lot of it starts with raw materials and equipment. Much of the equipment we've designed ourselves. So that very tight linkage between design and manufacturing is very important and has been important throughout our history. And the low volume, high value, and the criticality of high quality all mean that if it costs us a little bit more to manufacture here, that's okay. Now, I'd actually think, I think it's hard to get numbers on this. I would bet we're actually the lowest cost manufacturer in the world too, largely because of our scale. Two things, sorry, our scale and our experience. We actually know how to get it right.
Okay, so I can understand. I mean, and especially around the high value, low volume, and the tight link between design and manufacturing. Generally, Australia, do you have any? I mean, one of the things that the words that I've heard a lot in the last year, and I'm going to ask a little bit about COVID, but is sovereign capability in the context of many things, potential breakdowns of security, breaches in supply chain, for any number of different areas. What is your perspective as a big company like yours in tech around manufacturing and sovereign capability?
It's a very topical question. I think we've got to be really careful of simple solutions to complex problems. And I mean, the reality of global supply chains today is that they are global. And we have, I don't know how many countries we've got suppliers in, but it would be a huge number. It just not, and I'll take us as a narrow example, it would not be possible for us to be in any one country and only source from that country, with the possible exception of the US, and maybe China in time. I do think that if we look at what happened in COVID, we certainly did run short of personal protective equipment in hospitals. There was some risk around some medical supplies. I think there is a case for having what you might call strategic stockpiles of some critical base equipment or supplies to cope with some period of disruption. But I'd be very careful of sort of a put up the walls and let's assume we can do everything here. We won't. And look, in Cochlear by its nature is a global business. If that happens, it's reciprocal. So if we say, look, we can only make here what we need, we also shouldn't expect other countries to buy things from us, because they should be making their own. Now, if that was true, again, cochlear implants would only be made in the US and in China. There's no other country in the world that would have the ability to make them.
Very interesting perspective, in particular that simple solution to a complex, highly complex problem. Greg's asked quite a long question here, and I'm going to try to. Actually, Greg, do you mind just asking this yourself, since you're an ex-Cochlear person? Maybe you can jump in.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry for being verbose. So I was there at Cochlear, 14 Mars Road when it floated. I have a really good picture I should send you of everybody on that day. Anyway,
as you should. Yes.
We were doing a due diligence, and I think all those things had to appear in the prospectus. And the big thing that we were worried about in those days was stem cells. They were coming out and they were going to change everything. Now, 25 years down the track, Cochlear does not appear to have been impacted in any way by stem cells. And my question is, does anything keep you awake at night that something might appear on the front of a newspaper, or that could really impact on Cochlear's business?
Yeah, great, good question. And so I think, for a long time, some of these potential threats have been 10 years away, and they have been for 20 years. So look, there's nothing particular that keeps me awake. We actually got a range of experts from around the world to talk to us last week about just this topic. What else is going on in hearing loss research around the world? And one of the things we've seen over certainly the last 5 years is that governments, companies, people have realized that hearing loss is one of the most prevalent medical conditions in the world and one of the least treated. So there's a whole lot more research money coming into hearing loss now than there was even 5 years ago. And that money is going into genetics research, it's going into biologics, it's going into pharma, it's going into devices. And so there's certainly been progress in the last 5 years, definitely on the pharma front. There are a few interesting drug compounds out there that sort of have some indication they may do something to slow the rate of hearing loss as people age. There's nothing on the market yet, so there's nothing that's been through the clinical trials that you need to do to get to market. But there's certainly more going on, which is, I think it's a really good thing. There's more money, more research. And on stem cells specifically, it again is at a level where there's some interesting research going on, but nothing looks too close, and significant questions over viability and practicality.
Still 10 years away.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. There's room for other questions if anyone wants to type something in. But I want to, I think the question that is inevitable to come up is 2020 has been an interesting year for the world, and can you tell us a little bit about how that's impacted Cochlear? You're the CEO. I mean, what have you noticed, and what are some stories from the year?
Yeah, look, I'm looking forward to the end of this year. Certainly, when we started it, we didn't. No one anticipated what was going to happen and how significant it would be. But we've come through it well. In March and April, we saw an 80% reduction in surgeries. Our revenue fell by more than 60%. So it was a real, the single biggest, I think, the single biggest event in Cochlear's history in terms of the impact on our revenue. And that was with elective surgeries being stopped in most countries around the world. Fortunately, they restarted pretty quickly, and I think we did the we did the right things, including raising capital to make sure the company was safe. And one of the things about Cochlear is when there's 600,000 people, more than 600,000 people with our implants, they depend on Cochlear for the rest of their life for their hearing. Because the implant, our design goal is that will last a lifetime, but the external components that drive the implant are not quite consumer electronics, but they're not far away and they do fail. Without them, the person doesn't hear. So we've got to be around to support them for the next 100 years, and that restarts every day the next 100 years. So we raised capital to make sure that we were financially secure. But then I think we saw things bounce back pretty quickly, and it's pretty interesting. There's starting to be some papers on this now, but mask wearing has actually really highlighted people's hearing loss because there are a number of people who have a level of hearing loss who lip read, and they do it subconsciously, and they use it as an aid to hearing. The other thing about masks is they attenuate the sound, and they particularly attenuate more, at least some of the masks, the important frequencies for speech. So if someone's already got hearing loss, it's actually exacerbated if they're listening to someone with a mask. So what we're seeing is, it's still anecdotal, but we're actually seeing a lot of people in several countries who've been thinking about getting a cochlear implant, now getting one. Because I said, actually, I've realised with mask wearing, or I realised in 2 months of isolation that when only phone calls or FaceTime or Zoom meetings, which has a narrower bandwidth for the sound already, was the way of communicating, and I couldn't do it. So it's actually perhaps heightened. We're hoping that out of this, hearing loss will get more of the recognition, attention it deserves from people who have it, who tend to ignore it. But we're coming through strongly, and I'm part of being able to be financially strong as we continued all of our research programs and product development investment through this year. We've retained all of our people through the drop in revenue, because that's where, technology company, that's where your value is. It's in the people, not in the assets. So we've been, because of the rebound, we're actually going to finish the year in a stronger position than when we started.
That's a remarkable story about the masks, and I think there's versions of that in everywhere. Whether it's the higher ed sector, and things that you uncover, one thing goes away and you uncover a new opportunity. And I guess on that basis, besides this example and what you've just said, anything, for instance, operationally that you've changed and had to change and said, okay, well, actually this is a good way to do things. Let's keep it this way. What about, for example, Zoom meetings? We're more often.
Look, I mean, me and many people in Cochlear spend, in the old times, a significant amount of time traveling. I would spend probably 100 days a year overseas, which is the nature of, if you run a business from Australia where 96% of your revenue comes from outside Australia, you've got to spend a lot of time away. I haven't been overseas since March, and it looks like it's going to be at least 6 months, if not 9 months, before I go again. And I'm still able to do my job. And so I will travel less. I think we will all travel less coming out of this, because meetings like this are actually pretty effective. I think they're not great for developing new relationships, but once you've got relationships, maintaining them this way is effective. So I think we'll definitely see a reduction in air travel. Like many companies, we've been able to make decisions and prioritise harder, something that we should have probably been doing beforehand, but we've been forced to do it and to move quickly behind that. And I think from an external or healthcare delivery perspective, the importance of being able to deliver care at home, telehealth, which means fully digital, integrated, connected solutions, has really been highlighted, which is a huge opportunity. And so we've accelerated our spending in developing solutions for people at home. Obviously, you can't have the implant surgery at home, but there is a point in the future when, beyond the surgery, a lot of the rest of the care could be able to be delivered at home, unless there's a significant problem. So that's a huge change for healthcare systems, and a significant technology challenge, a significant regulatory challenge too. Okay, excellent. There's a
couple of questions I did skip over, and I thought just to make sure we get this. This is an interesting one, if I understand it correctly. To what extent does Cochlear get funding from the government or support from the government? Maybe because they realize how valuable you are to the nation, and or.
We get a little bit. So that the main way that we get support is through the R&D tax incentive. So for money that we spend on R&D, we effectively get a reduced corporate tax rate. So it's been at about 8%. So it's worked out up till now that we've got about, if we spend $100 million of R&D, eligible R&D, which we do, we get about $8 million off reduction in our tax in Australia. That's the main form of support. We get a little bit through research grants. Actually, we get a little bit more in Europe than we do in Australia on research grants. But that's the main form, and the change in the R&D tax incentive that happened recently means that amount will go up. It'll probably double. And look, and we think, given the high, I don't want to get into corporate tax discussion, but Australia does have a very high and uncompetitive corporate tax rate. And that is one of the reasons that companies won't set up here. What the R&D tax incentive and other incentives do is they actually lower the tax rate if you're investing. And that does make sense. But apart from that, we are, and we spend close to $1 billion a year. So 8 million isn't a huge amount, but it's certainly very, very welcome. Mm-hmm. But other than that, there's very little government support.
And what about in the other direction, in the sense of investing in globally, I guess? Does Cochlear invest in startup companies? Do you identify?
We do, actually. We've invested in a couple of companies, two of them in Australia, actually, where we have through our implant technology, we think one of the, if not the most sophisticated head-based nerve stimulator in the world, and we use it in hearing. Yeah, there are a whole range of other therapies where that technology, an implantable nerve stimulator, very small, very low implantable nerve stimulator, has value. So we've invested in a company that is looking to treat sleep apnea through stimulating the hypoglossal nerve with an implant. There's also a company in Australia that's doing some work for epilepsy, using an implant to monitor electrical signals in the brain of people with epilepsy, with a view to try to be able to predict when they might be having a seizure. So a diagnostic plus. So there are a number of, there's two examples of companies we've been invested in. There are others. So we are, just over the last 4 years, started to invest a bit of money in startup companies where we think we can bring some know-how or technology that may be of value.
Okay, that's interesting about the epilepsy technology, because I know that there is some research here in engineering around that, and possibly people on the call who are involved, or if not leading that type of research. One question on that basis actually is how do these companies surface for you? Do you have a crack team that are kind of out there looking for new opportunities?
We do, yeah. So we've got a small group of people who are out looking. We get approached, both of those two are companies that approached us because we do have such terrific technology. People see our capability, and it's actually really hard to make a small, reliable implant. And so they come and talk to us and say, how do you do this? And the conversations start from there. We can do more than those. We can do more together than just giving you some advice. So it works both ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lesson or a message in there as well to startup companies and researchers. I want to sort of start steering towards a close. A thought I had is what the committee that Dan Tian's put together that you're going to be a part of, and I did have a look at the membership. I can't exactly recall who else is on it, but there's some big names. What do you see coming out? What could you anticipate coming out of that and pulling down?
Yeah, so look, I've only just had an introductory meeting on it so far, so it's just kicking off. But I think that the underlying premise here is that if you look at a range of industries, Australia does do extremely well in research, and particularly in university research. The further, as you then go sort of through commercialisation, we do a bit worse again. You look at companies, you know, how many companies are there like Cochlear in Australia that are actually long-term result of commercialising university research? Very, very few. So I think the broad problem is that we seem to be generating a lot of good research, or a lot of research, and a lot of it highly rated. It falls off pretty quickly in terms of our ability to really get the value from that research. You know, and when a government looks at this, value means creating jobs and creating high-paying jobs, which I think is a very good thing. So that's the question: how do we make that better? And look, I'm welcome ideas from people on this call to contact me separately if you've got some thoughts on how we can, you know, what are the real problems here and why doesn't it work? Because it's, you know, I think the government's actually genuine about trying to build more research-based businesses that create the sorts of jobs we want coming out of the, you know, which would be good for the economy coming out of COVID-19.
I think the general sentiment is that it's great that this kind of thing is being discussed at that level, and that somebody like you is in there and able to advocate, I guess, for things like what we care about, and having seen it firsthand yourself. I mean, I'm tempted to get into a conversation about this and how do we bring those two things together. There's gaps. There's no one size fits all, but I think, you know, like anything, it does come down to the people and the relationships and starting one thing at a time. So certainly we're trying to be more and more receptive to the needs of industry and how to work more closely with them. And now I noticed that Payman said he has a question if time allows. I think we could say time allows for a quick question, and I can see your face has popped up there, so you're eager. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'm a postdoc in biomedical engineering, and thank you very much for your time. My question is probably from the perspective of a customer, if you like. I'm still not one of your customer, but one thing that I think it would be very helpful to have around is the devices that can filter the noise that you don't want to hear, because a lot of disturbance will come from the noise that's, if they're not very loud, we don't really realize. I'm wondering if there is any interest on that area.
Yeah, Payman, it's actually a huge part of our product and our research is how to filter out background noise. Because in normal hearing, our brains do an incredible job along with the design of our ears to focus on speech. You know, we can hear speech even when the background noise is higher. You can't do that with the cochlear implant, but we do. We're trying to get as close to that as we can, and sort of in one sentence, the way to do it is by having two microphones and taking the timing differences of sound hitting those two microphones to filter out noise from behind or beside and not from in front, or the equivalent. So very, very important, but we're nowhere near as good as the natural ears and the brain at doing that yet.
Thanks, Payman, for that technical question to cap off and really test Dig on his knowledge of Cochlear. Thank you all for joining us. Dig,
thank you.
Thank you for your time. You're an extremely busy person, so we appreciate you joining us, and I think a lot will have come out of this. So without further ado, have a great break if you get one.
James, thanks for asking me on. People Thank you for joining. And I'm serious on if people have ideas on commercialisation, I'm very happy to hear them. And perhaps, James, you've got my email address, so people could ask you to. Depending on how many ideas, I'll try to respond. But I'm certainly very interested in ideas on commercialisation of research.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I think you might get inundated. All right, thanks, Dig. All the best. Thanks all.
Thanks, James.
Cheers. Bye.